guest is someone who's lived many lives in music, from being a teenage rapper in Montreal to touring the world with the Team Warriors, to shaking things up in the music rights business by spearheading international operations at Reservoir. He founded PopArabia in partnership with Reservoir, establishing the company as the go-to sub-publisher in the Middle East for catalogs from Sony, Concord, Cobalt, and more. He's also the architect of ESMAA, the rights management outfit untangling performance, mechanical, and neighboring rights across the Middle East. And now, with the launch of PopIndia, we're hoping to see more of him in the subcontinent. Please welcome the ever-evolving, always intriguing Hussein Spek Yusuf, aka Spek. Welcome to Let's Talk Music, Spek. It's great to have you here finally.
Thanks for having me.
Amazing. So, I think, we don't need to do the usual small talk. So I typically do a little history tour
Sure.
with my guests, but I want to mix it up a little bit with you. So I
Okay.
think let's start off with your journey at PopArabia
Sure.
and kind of like go into a little bit of how you've, made Arabic culture an integral part of the identity of the company. And
Sure.
I also wanted to understand the thought process behind it because you clearly saw an opportunity there and grabbed it. So just, if you could walk us through that, that'd be great.
Yeah, no worries. There's a few things in your intro that I should probably correct slightly. But it sort of segues nicely into me telling the story, I guess. So I founded PopArabia in 2011 in partnership with 2454, which is the Abu Dhabi Media Zone. That was prior to my involvement with Reservoir. I had moved to the country in 2006, and I set up a business in 2008, which was a terrible year to launch any business, much less a copyright business in the Middle East. And following the financial crisis and the rest of it, Abu Dhabi had set up the media zone, which is sort of referred to as 2454, which stands for the geocoordinates for Abu Dhabi. And they had set up 2454, and what they were doing that was a little bit different than the other media-free zones was they had a VC arm that was investing in the kinds of businesses that they wanted to encourage to enter the market, and they were going to put active investments in businesses that they thought would help to cultivate the ecosystem that they were trying to develop. So they had done stuff in film and TV with people like Sky or with Cartoon Network, but music was not something that they had touched. And so I came to them with the idea of PopArabia. They liked it. They invested in it, and they became partners, and we launched the business. The business was set up initially to represent international catalogs. I had been a publisher in the UK, even though I'm from Canada. And I had known that, there's a sort of global sub-publishing network, and there's, and around the world, there's a list of sort of publishers that represent other publishers. In some markets, it's very crowded. In some markets, there's very few options. I knew in the Middle East, there were no options. There were literally zero options. And what most of the publishers were doing was they are representing the Middle East and North Africa through their Turkish office or Turkish sub-publisher. And nobody in the Middle East really thinks of Turkey as the Middle East. So I knew that there was an opportunity, and I had visited Dubai and Abu Dhabi, early, and recognized that I thought there was, I looked into it. Being a music person, this is what you do. As I'm not a lawyer, but I think like one often, and. First thing I did was I read the copyright law, and I studied it, and I recognized that the rights that you needed were protected under the legislation. And the copyright law at that point, the most current copyright law had been drafted in 2002, and I was visiting around 2004 and 5. So, and then I moved over in 2006. So I recognized that, there is law, there's a system in place in this country. There's a ambitious vision for where, the next few decades we're going to be at that point. All the stuff that's happening now had been very clearly mapped out, 25 years ago. And it was an exciting place, to be around. You sort of felt a buzz in the cities when you were in Dubai or Abu Dhabi. So that was my light bulb moment. I thought, well, maybe I'll be the first person to set up a music publishing business in the Middle East, and then I'll go talk to global publishers and see if I can get their rights to represent it, and I'll fight the good fight and try to get these rights respected. When you're early in your career, that's it's like ambitious, and naive at the same time, perhaps. But that's what I did. That was the idea behind it. And sure enough, once we set up PopArabia, we very quickly were representing Universal, and then Sony, and then Warner Chappell. And over the past 14 years or so, we've represented all of the majors. At present, we don't represent Sony anymore. Sony set up a local office here in Dubai. Sony Publishing, that is. And I think that is, I see that as a success in a way. The fact that there is a market means that it's interesting enough for the biggest music publisher in the world to actually want to set up offices here. I don't think that would have been the case, if we hadn't done the work that we've done over the past 14 years.
Exactly.
So, in a strange way, and I always said this, years ago, when I was convincing or talking to Reservoir about getting involved in PopArabia, I said to them even then that if we're successful at our mission, then we will also be successful at losing clients as a sub-publisher, because we will have made it easy enough to enter the market, and that there is a market here. And if we build a market where there's enough, there's where you don't need a middleman anymore, then we will end up competing with the people that we've brought in as clients, and that should be okay, because that means that's a sign of the maturity of the market, and our pivot needs to be focused on ownership and investing in Arabic repertoire. And so that's what we did. In 2015, I got offered the job to be the head of creative in the US at Reservoir. For a kid who grew up on hip hop, that was a dream come true. And it was really hard to say no to that opportunity.
Yeah.
And I also loved what Reservoir was about. Golnar and Rel, who are the CEO and COO respectively of Reservoir, are, people that I really admire. I felt I could learn a lot from, and I loved what they were doing as an independent with flair, at Reservoir, and it was an ambitious mission. And so I took the gig. I left my team running PopArabia in my absence, and I was in New York from 2015 to 2019. And by 2019, Spotify and the other global DSPs really started entering the Middle East and India and Africa, really between 2019 and 2021. Yeah. And, I say this to people all the time, when you're in America, the world revolves around America. As a Canadian, I can say that, who was living there. And it just felt like I was the only person amongst my contemporaries that was really focused on the sort of quiet developments that were starting to happen in the emerging markets. And I could sort of see around the corner. And it was really obvious to me that as streaming platforms enter these markets, so too shall the interest and the focus on local language repertoire, and
Yeah.
that these, high populous centers of the world were going to eventually overtake, the Western markets because there's just more people.
Mm.
And that might be a 10-year arc, or 5 to 10 year arc, but it felt like an inevitability. Now, in 2017 or 18, talking about this in New York, nobody was really thinking about that because it was
Right.
the heyday of streaming growth, and
Yeah.
the world was really about what was going on in the States or the UK. But I spoke to Rel and Golnar about it, and I said, look, like 4.5 years later, 5 years in, um, mission that we had to build out, Reservoir's front-facing creative business in the U.S.,
Mm.
an A&R business, had been accomplished. We had set up offices in Nashville and L.A. We had hired the best executives in the business to lead our A&R activities, and I felt a little bit like, mission accomplished. This is good. I'm happy to stay, and go to the, parties in LA every year, but that's not really why I got into the business. I was really much more interested in how the business was going to develop and grow, and what this was going to mean to a global market.
Yeah.
And so they agreed with me, and they said, let's do it as partners. We'll come in. And so at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, they invested and became my partners in PopArabia. And I now play a dual role where I oversee
Yeah.
international and emerging markets for Reservoir whilst running PopArabia, and now overseeing PopIndia as well.
Yeah. That's a lot of work. So, um, but again, kind of like, taking a few steps back to also figure out what led to you making that shift into the music rights business, right?
Mm.
You were an artist. Technically, I'd still like to think once an artist or always an artist, right?
Hey, I just dropped my new album, my first album in like 24 years. So yeah, I'm
Yeah,
still an artist at
exactly.
heart.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so you're still an artist. So, um, how did that happen? Like, how did that interest to work in music rights come about? And what was that association with Reservoir like? And what do you think, you've learned over there, which you're kind of like, you know, adapting to Pop Arabia with, and now with Pop India as well?
Yeah, that's very good questions. Look, the shift into, becoming a music publisher effectively was an accident. You know, I was 30 when I became a publisher, so up until the age from, I had my first manager when I was 14, so, and then
Wow.
I signed my first record deal when I was 17. So I had been in the business from
For a
as
while by
young,
now.
as long as you could really be. Um, and, uh, and that's all I did. I was a songwriter and artist, and I was successful at it. The
Mm.
Dream Warriors were, prior to Drake, were the biggest hip hop export out of Canada. We had charted across, the world, Australia, Europe, and Canada. I
Yeah.
had a solo career and signed publishing deals and record deals and did all of that, rock star stuff.
Yeah.
But I was always sort of the person who was the nerdiest about the business side of it in the band.
Mm.
And I spent a lot of time, really just learning from the band's manager,
Mm.
initially, who taught me a lot. And actually, um, he used to teach music business at one of the local music schools, on the
Oh,
side, right? And so I would just sit in his classes for free, because I was a member of the Dream Warriors. It was like, hey, we got Spek from Dream Warriors sitting in class today, and the students all thought it was cool. And so I would just learn that way, right? By the time I um, I left the Dream Warriors, the UK was our biggest market as a band.
Mm.
We were bigger in the UK than we were in Canada, even though we were Canadian. So when I was trying to pursue a solo career, it felt like I should start in the UK because that
Sure.
was where my fan base was. And
Yeah.
so I moved to London and I did that. And I toured with Us Three and recorded with,
Mm.
members of
Yeah.
Jamiroquai and did all of that stuff, right? That's when I met
Yeah.
Nitin Sawhney, and I was
Yeah.
sort of a big part of the whole Asian underground movement that was happening then. So I was really musically enamored with the UK,
Mm.
and um and I was out there. And years later, that same manager had become the head of international at a big independent publisher that was looking
Oh.
to do acquisitions around the world. And I was the guy that he knew the best that lived in the UK, and I was, the kid that was sort of his understudy. So he asked me to consult for the company, and that was my first paying gig outside of being a songwriter in my life, and
Yeah.
so I did that for 6 months, and then they offered me a permanent role.
Mm.
And I was conflicted, frankly. I didn't really want to take it because I felt strongly that I would, if you're going to do it right, like whatever I do,
Yeah.
I really want to throw myself into whatever it
Yeah.
is I do. And I felt that if I throw myself into being a music executive, then that means it's the end of my songwriting career. And I didn't, I'd never, I thought I was going to be a songwriter my whole life. So, whatever it was, I tried it. It was just the confluence of events. I just turned 30. I was just married. It was sort of like that time where you start to rethink, what you're going to do. And I thought, well, worst case scenario, I'll try it. And if I fail, I'll go back to writing songs, So, as it turned out, I got pretty good at it. And, um, and, and that sort of period, was when I first got really interested in what was going on in emerging markets, because I was based in the UK and I was overseeing Europe.
Yeah.
But I was much more interested in what was going on in emerging markets.
Mm.
And at a number of these conferences, I had met these Indian companies that held publishing rights,
Mm.
uh, but were not collecting any revenues
Yeah.
for them. And I started, I'd be at MIPCOM or MIPTV or one of these conferences and talking to these Bollywood studios and
Mm.
asking them. So I'd ask them, so who owns the rights? This, I was probing, and essentially I worked out that they were holding rights that they weren't generating revenues on. And
Yeah.
when I would explain it to them, they thought that I sounded like a dodgy, like the
Ponzi
sort of
scam.
the scam call, like I have money waiting for you in a bank account somewhere,
Yeah.
So they thought I was crazy, and I thought that that was an opportunity again. So I
Yeah.
went back to
Yeah.
my bosses and I said to them, "Will you let me fly to India?
Mm.
Because I think there's an opportunity to get into the Indian scene." And this was
Mm.
2005, and to their credit, they gave me the sort of runway to go check it out. And that's when I came to India for the first time and
Mm.
met a lot of the people in the Indian scene that were just first starting to get together to fight on behalf of composer and publishing rights.
Yeah.
And I was completely inspired by these guys. But it was a very clear uphill battle. The film studios clearly were holding all of the power, and
Yeah.
were not necessarily keen to give it up. And it,
Yeah.
it just seemed like a David and Goliath battle, but the sort of battle that is worth spending your life doing,
Ending it. Yeah.
Yeah, and then so at that's where the idea of PopArabia really first came from, because I
Mm.
thought to myself, I'm either going to move to India and spend my life doing this,
Mm.
but if I do that, I'm either competing with these guys that I've just met who I'm very inspired by,
Mm.
or I will or I end up working for them. And I
Mm,
wasn't sure that I wanted to do either. But
mm.
on the way back to London, I stopped in the Gulf for the first time, in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, and that's when I started asking, "Oh, who's doing that out here?" And that was really where the brainchild of PopArabia came from. Um, yeah,
That, that- and I think that's quite an inspiring leap, right? Because you've been in Canada, you're kind of familiar with that market, and then you moved to the UK, you discover a new market, and you've actually taken that leap of faith and set up something that nobody's heard of before from scratch
yeah,
in a region that you are also kind of getting yourself acquainted with.
yeah,
And clearly, each of these regions work so differently, like because the cultural nuances are different and the industries themselves are very different. And for example, in India, the industry is not organized in the East, right? And
yeah,
the way rights have historically worked in the music industry, it's been intrinsically linked with ownership of music and creative material with the film industry. Like the
yeah.
production houses have owned music as well. So I think there was a lot of change that happened in the last like 20 years, and I feel like the last 5 years, okay, maybe 7 years. I think after like the DSPs kind of like made their arrival concrete. I
Yeah.
think that's when the actual change really took place. Like, and we're still kind of playing catch up, on several levels. But I feel like there's so much of music that's being generated here that the market and the industry is by default that big. So there's so much more opportunity.
Hmm.
Um, so I feel like, and I'm assuming that's pretty much the same case when you're looking at the Gulf and the Middle East. And how does the music industry work there? I mean, if you could, like, very briefly, I know it could like actually be an entire episode on its
Well,
own, but
look, I think there's a lot of similarities between India and the Middle East.
uh,
In a number of ways, I would say India is more advanced than the Middle East,
mm,
or further down the evolutionary chart.
mm,
Just because there's been such because Bollywood was so
yeah,
sort of
yeah,
such a behemoth as an industry, and it
yeah,
encompassed music that that's just been the case. But the idea that master rights and publishing rights are sort of wrapped up together, and typically the
yeah,
label is the owner of the publishing rights. That's not the case in the West.
mm,
But that is the case generally. If you are a master owner in India historically, you're also the
yeah,
owner of all rights.
yeah,
So that's the same is historically true, or has been true, of the Middle East. Because of the way that the business was sort of set up, what you had was a set of rules, right? So just from a legal perspective, right? If you wanted to release an album
yeah,
in the UAE when it was a physical business, you had to um, sort of sign off on these sort of
mm,
waivers to say, here's a declaration that I own all rights in this product. And
mm,
only when somebody signs that they control all IP in the physical product are they allowed to physically release that product through
mm,
whichever ministry has to stamp and allow you to release, said product. So it was a default mechanism whereby if you wanted to release music, in a physical form, you had to essentially sign these declarations that would get stamped by the Ministry of Culture or the Ministry of Economy, or whoever it might be, depending on which country you're in. Whichever the competent authority was, you would not be able to release that music unless you could say that you controlled all rights. And so
mm,
as a result, um, the writers, the performers, everybody, the musicians, everybody that got involved in a project had to also assign their rights to one entity, so that one entity could then sign that piece of paper that said that they owned all rights. So it
wow,
wasn't
mm,
possible to have separate industries at that time when it was a physical business, which is
yeah,
exactly why I always saw streaming as the the sort of
great people.
the great equalizer and the lightning rod for change.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
frankly, when we were representing major publishers and we were going to the major labels and telling them, hey, you've released a bunch of CDs and you owe us mechanical royalties because I
Mm,
represent the publishing sister company, your publishing sister company I'm representing, and you need to pay us some royalties.
mm,
It was an uphill battle that they refused, they refused to pay for many,
yeah.
many years, and they weren't nice conversations. And frankly, I think that they saw me as the dodgy guy for even daring to ask them for a royalty.
Yeah.
And with a streaming platform, we no longer, the label is no longer God, right?
Mm,
Because, the problem with the Indian industry and the Middle Eastern industry is that publishing was treated as, even when it first started coming in India, publishing was treated as the stepsister,
yeah.
of
Absolutely.
the label business,
Yeah.
and it's like, you're my little stepbrother. You'll take whatever crumbs I can throw you, right? You don't have rights on your own. You don't have a right to challenge what we do because we have the upper hand, right?
Mm,
And I think it's been important, um, as we develop the regional business,
mm,
that
mm,
as an analogy, it's like, no, we don't want to repeat the mistakes that we saw happen in India. We don't want
mm,
our publishing industry to play second fiddle
mm,
to label business, right?
mm,
They're two distinct industries, different sets of rights, different sets of beneficiaries,
yeah.
and so that sort of distinction, I think, was important. Once we knew that DSPs were involved, now we can get paid by the DSPs. We don't have to rely on the labels to do it. And if the DSPs are global players and they recognize these rights, which they do, then
Mm,
then then it's not necessarily a battle to recognize our right and to ensure that a license is in place so that we're paid for our rights too.
yeah.
Streaming made that possible.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we'd still be fighting with the labels right now, trying to extract mechanical royalties.
For sure. And I think the same analogy applies to India as well, right? Because I think we discussed this as well. Uh, it's after the DIY distribution kind of came in to the picture when people realize that I don't need a label anymore to have my music out there, and there are other avenues for consumption of music. Like earlier, you just had the cassettes and the tapes and the CDs, and like it was very specific to those modes of media, right? And
Yeah,
I think with streaming coming in and with DIY distribution, it really kind of like spun everything on its head. I mean, there are you do have the pros and cons. I mean, today we're looking at a much larger problem of, does streaming really undervalue music because we've then looking at how much per stream pays out and so on and so forth. But I think with every phase of the music industry you're kind of battling new problems
sure.
and you have tech that will address those new problems and then you have more problems that come to,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
figure this, make that balance out.
yeah.
Um, so, I mean, given this context, the fact that you also actually built something like ESMAA
Hmm.
in the Middle East to address that acts as a collective management organization, right? So, would you call it the Copyright Society for the Gulf,
We are. Well,
technically?
look, the language that you use can be tricky. Like, look, technically, a CMO, as it's defined under UAE law, is a very specific thing.
Okay.
Our trade license to operate is as a rights management entity. So we
Mm-hmm.
could get into, legal and intellectual debates as to what the distinctions are between those two things. Ultimately, we both manage rights. We both
Mm.
license the rights that we control, and we distribute royalties against that. In
Okay.
that sense, we're the same as, how you would define a collecting society. But there are distinctions. Do you think of BMI as the same as PRS? I think many people do.
Yeah.
But technically BMI is a rights management entity and PRS is a CMO,
Mm.
so it's just, we're effectively the same as a legal structure as BMI is
Yeah.
in the UAE. And yeah, look, I think that because I'm still a songwriter and always have been a songwriter,
Yeah.
these challenges um, are feel like existential battles. They feel like moral battles sometimes. And and it just felt like there were, over the, the years that we had been representing and being a publisher in the region. At
Mm.
one point, I think we had over 90% market share of publishing rights in MENA, where we represented all of the
Wow.
majors and all of the indies.
Yeah.
So, we're, you over different periods of time, you gain catalogs that you represent and you lose some. But there was a point in time where we were representing really just about everything.
Yeah.
And, and so what ended up happening was radio stations or broad users of music would come to us and ask us for
Mm.
license to solve the broader licensing problem. At the time,
Mm.
the copyright law in the UAE states that if you're going to set up a CMO,
Yeah.
you need to get the express approval. You need to get basically a CMO permit from the Ministry of Economy in the UAE.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
at that time, I'm talking about prior to 2019.
Okay.
So for like, I don't know, for 17 years, people have been lobbying and trying to figure out how to get a CMO permit in the UAE,
Mm.
and they struggled. And the Ministry of Economy, they had other priorities, and so they weren't really focused on music rights as an issue
Mm.
until around 2019, 2020, I would say, right? Actually, it was probably 21 when things started to change.
Mm.
And so up until that period, we were like, well, if we can't get, um, if they're not issuing CMO permits, how
Mm.
are we supposed to license performance rights when the performance rights are
Yeah.
actually coming in from performing rights organizations? You need
Mm.
a you need the architecture of a vehicle that exists in the country in order to bring the rights in order for you
Yeah.
to license those rights locally. And nobody had created that local architecture, but we represented essentially the entire publishing industry.
Yeah.
So it got us thinking about, how could we solve the problem if we really wanted to? And is there a creative way that we could solve this? And maybe the fact that I'm a songwriter got me working creatively about how to get around, a difficult problem. And around 2019, 2020, when I moved back from New York, um, I I started seeing that there were rights management entities, as that's legally defined, starting to crop up in markets in Asia and Africa and Eastern
Yeah.
Europe. And in some
Mm.
cases, they were filling a vacuum left by either the lack of a CMO
Mm.
or um, a CMO that didn't function very well.
Mm.
And so some private entity came up as a private solution to solve the
Mhm.
same problems. And because the industry had also started shifting to digital and streaming, the nature of rights management was changing, like back in
Yeah.
the day, it was like, send me your cue sheet and it might be a piece of paper that was handwritten in with all the
Yeah.
songs that were played that day. Now we were getting billions of lines of data every week. And most CMOs around the world are like 100 years old. And so
Mm.
they're trying to update, to keep up with times. And, it was a technical challenge. And so suddenly these independent players started coming in and filling
Mm.
a void that the institutional players,
Mm.
in some markets were not well equipped to compete with.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
so I thought to myself, what if we did that in the UAE? Would that be legal?
Mhm.
And would we be allowed to do that? And we looked
Mhm.
into it, and to cut a long story short, we got legal advice. We, the Abu Dhabi government through the Abu Dhabi media zone was invested in my business. So I had a direct
Mm.
line into into Abu Dhabi to ask these questions, and
Right.
I got my answers, and once we understood that there was a way to do it that was perfectly legal,
Mm.
then we applied for a trade license to operate as a rights management entity to create ESMAA, and we were
Mm.
granted that by the Abu Dhabi Media Zone. And so once we had the trade license, then we were off to the races, and we had to go and ask CMOs around the world if they would give us their
Yeah.
rights,
Yeah.
so that we could license. And most people thought we were crazy or that this was never going to happen because they had all told us, like, why do you think you're going to be successful when nobody's been successful for 20 years trying this?
Mm.
And how are you going to get people to pay when they've never had to pay in the market? You're going to have to
Yeah.
show everybody. And I
Yeah.
said from the beginning, I'm not, that's not the approach that I'm trying to take with this. And, we had to slowly prove them one licensee by another. And that's exactly what we've done.
Yeah. I mean, I can imagine that's like a lot of enforcement work, right? And on ground implementation and having, I just like you mentioned, like having people pay for music has been, I think it continues to be the biggest problem that we face in India. The
Yeah.
copyright societies or collective management organizations face over here. And it's just that, I have a YouTube connection, I have a Spotify connection, and I'm playing it at my cafe. I'm paying Spotify or YouTube. Why do I need to pay anyone else? That's the whole
Yeah.
the logic behind it. And explaining to them how this works is just another like nightmare altogether.
Yeah.
So the fact that you have something like ESMA like running and active and really doing that kind of work, and I'm assuming there's been a trajectory, right? You have seen people adapting and
Yeah.
kind of like
We
agreeing
are.
to enforce.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, we're licensing. If anything, I think if there's we get so busy with the work that we don't spend
Mm.
probably enough time shouting from the rooftops about what it is that we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, um, so um, so that if there's any sort of shortfall, it might be that, yeah, I should spend more time doing marketing and PR, although I've tried to get better at it with, LinkedIn these days, um, but yeah, look, we're licensing music every week, there
Yeah.
isn't a week that goes by where we don't get a request to license a retail outlet or a gig or,
Mm.
something, and
Yeah.
we've been distributing quarterly for 5 years, and
Wow.
we've now in the past 24 to 36 months, we've distributed something in the order of about $3 million in royalties, which is not, you know, it's not, if you compare that to, I don't know what ASCAP or, PRS, they're turning over $1 billion a year. So it's nothing compared to that. But if you compare it to any other, um, either regional market or any other country where a new rights organization has
Yeah.
formed, and within the first couple of years they're distributing millions of dollars, like,
Yeah.
it's really not common.
It's not.
That's not typical,
Yeah. That's not typical
um
at all. So,
yeah.
how do you work with DSPs in the Middle East? And does ESMA have like, are you licensing with
Yeah,
them? Are you licensing from them? Rather?
we're licensing, we've been licensing the local services. The international services have historically gone through the existing, sort of European. They
Mm.
treat the emerging markets as an extension of their European deals. But there's a couple of local DSPs, and we've licensed them. So yes, yeah, we're doing that, distributing on a regular basis for those deals as well.
Great. I mean, that's so much that you're doing with PopArabia and ESMA, and now with your arrival in India with PopIndia.
Yeah.
I know you've signed on Yohani based on the text releases they see.
Yep.
But what's your vision for PopIndia? And is it I'd like to think that it's not just targeting India, but you're just looking at the subcontinent,
Yeah,
right? Like,
South Asia.
yeah,
Um,
Southeast Asia, yeah.
I mean, look, I think a lot of our attention is obviously focused around India. That's sort of where a lot of the action is. But I'm hugely interested in Pakistan. I'm hugely interested in Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh as well has got sort of a great, vibrant music scene these days. So we're looking at all of those markets. We call it Pop India really because I think the approach that we're taking is a little bit more. All of this falls under reservoir in some way. It's all sort of reservoir um, as a company. But Pop India as a name felt a little bit more akin to the business that we're doing in the Middle East than necessarily a replication of what we're doing in the UK or US. In the US, for example, Reservoir is a publishing company, is the music company. That's how we started the business. And now we are just a music company, right? Because Reservoir owns interests in management. We own Chrysalis Records. We own Tommy Boy Records. So we have a label business. But historically, our label businesses have had their own sort of branding and names. And Reservoirs as a name is focused, a little bit more on the publishing activity, or certainly known for that. With PopArabia, once we started investing in regional repertoire, it became obvious that you don't really want to just, you don't want to apply Western rules in a market where that's. And in the Middle East, I was never going to just buy publishing rights because those publishing rights are tied up with master rights, and it didn't make sense to try to bifurcate something that wasn't bifurcated. And so we've been buying catalogs where we own master rights and publishing rights, and as a result of that, PopArabia is essentially an indie label as well as a publisher. And our approach in India wanted to take a similar approach. We also think that, the PopArabia business was built initially through sub-publishing, representing other people's repertoire. That's not a thing that Reservoir typically does around the world, or certainly, historically, we have not done. Reservoir doesn't compete for sub-publishing business. There might be catalogs here or there just through relationships that we might represent, but as a rule, generally, we're not one of the companies that are, the go-to sub-publishers that will take on any clients. We're a little bit more, we focus the resources that we build into the repertoire that we acquire. That's a little bit more the approach at the Reservoir level. At PopArabia, we've still got a very healthy sub-publishing business because people need representation in difficult markets, and they want somebody that actually understands their rights. And we've built a reputation for years now as trustworthy partners that can establish value in markets where it's hard to establish value. And it felt to us that the Indian business was going to be more similar to that than say what we're doing in the States. And so that's really why we used the PopArabia Pop branding. We see this as our sort of vehicle into how we approach emerging markets in a slightly different way than we approach Western markets. So yes, we're signing artists around the region. It's not just India. But we are really focused on buying catalogs. The catalog business is, it sort of helps to, lay the concrete for the foundation of what you're trying to build. If you've got enough catalog, then you've got more stuff that you can license. You've got more stuff that you can sync. You've got, and the more stuff that you have in that side of the business gives you leverage, in many ways. The fact that, for example, PopArabia are very active music supervisors, for film and television productions in the Middle East, that makes us an attractive label or publisher to sign with. Because, if you're an artist that wants to get in the latest, in the latest TV show that's hot on Netflix. Well, you're working with the company that does a lot of the licensing, at a broad level. And the fact that we've got
Yeah.
a sub-publishing business
Yeah.
means that we just have more repertoire to license. And it's more
Exactly.
likely that even if we're not the music supervisors, you have to call us if you want music in your show, because there's a high likelihood that we represent just about anything that you need. And so we see a similar approach with India. There is a lack of music supervisors in the
Mm.
Indian market. That's changing, of course.
It's changing
Netflix,
now. Yeah.
Amazon, and these guys are investing
Yeah.
in courses to teach a new, sort of wave of music supervisors. But that skill set is still something that's lacking that we are quite strong on. Um, there's still a lack of sub publishers in India because
Yeah. For sure.
there's not a lot of good, independent options out there. And um, and the combination of that with the catalog and signing frontline artists, I think, places us in a strong position,
Mm.
to sort of build the business up organically. And Reservoir was started out as a family business.
Yeah.
It's Khosrow Shahi family
Yeah.
behind it. I think that our business is like a family business, and so we approach things like a real business. We're not just throwing money at a sexy new
Yeah.
market and hoping to see what happens. We're building it like any organic business would, from the ground up, one brick at a time.
And there's one thing which I wanted to I know we've shared our notes on this, and that's about identifying yourself as an indie label, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we know that, uh, given your experience with the industry as well, you've seen a lot of models which have applied to the industry so far, which aren't necessarily working for the artist. It's not really sustainable for the artist. Is there something which you think, as PopArabia or as PopIndia, is there something that you'd like to do different from what the traditional labels or the so-called majors have done in the past? Is there a model which you'd like to use or which you'd like to encourage building, which would be more sustainable for the industry? Because we are looking at I feel like a very strange time that we are in right now, because from going to suing, from suing company like Suno and Video, you now have the majors signing up with them to license their catalogs to them. How is that going to impact us as an industry, right? And I feel like this is where the indie labels maybe do have a kind of responsibility to, shift and build models which are not exploitative, which are a lot more conducive to the artists growing in a sustainable way and not getting threatened by the fact that, we have all of this that's going on. So,
Yeah, so I don't think that there's any one model that I could sort of say this is it, right?
yeah, yeah,
I think the way that we've really tried to approach this always has been that we're agnostic. We have to sort of, there's we've done every type of deal that you can sort of think of, generally speaking.
mm,
Historically, we've not done a whole bunch of admin deals, but we've done admin deals. And it just sort
mm,
of depends on the client and the process and what sort of works. I think that the way you have to think about the business, particularly as it pertains to emerging markets, is you have to be adaptive, and
yeah,
you
yeah,
have to sort of, one thing I will say is that the way that we've tried to approach our deals is being in the Middle East and being, in India. I'm privy. I've seen obviously a lot of
yeah,
contracts from that artists
yeah,
have signed with labels or distributors and the rest of it. And there's some terrible, contracts out there, right? Like,
yeah,
and I would say there's a large percentage of the contracts out there historically were just really bad.
yeah,
We don't do that. We don't do that sort of stuff. I think that there's a fair balance,
mm,
which I'll
mm,
say is, you know, there are terms that you would get in the US today in a publishing deal,
mm,
right? That are
mm,
the standard terms in a publishing deal in the US are slightly
mm,
different than the terms are in the UK. Just because they're
mm.
both in the West doesn't mean that, the way that you approach deals are
Yeah,
exactly the same. There is
yeah,
a difference between
yeah,
UK deals and US deals, right?
yeah, for sure. Yeah,
And in the same sense, um, when I talk to people in India or the Middle East, they'll be like, "Oh, I want like a US deal," right? And it's like, well, yeah, I get that, right?
yeah,
And I'm not saying that because we don't do the sort of deals that I'm talking about that I've
yeah,
seen that
yeah,
are really terrible for artists, in
yeah,
every
yeah.
way, right?
Exploitative. Yeah.
Exploitative, right? But I do think that every sort of structure in a deal has to be reflective of the relationship. And there's different kinds of risks involved when you're signing an artist in India or the Middle East than there are in the UK or the US right now, right?
For sure.
Your
Yeah.
ability to recoup your investment, there's
Mm,
a there's a different level of risk involved. There's a
yeah.
different the amount of time it takes you to recoup the same amount of money is quite different.
Mm,
The streaming rates are
exactly.
different, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I'm not saying, oh, it's just an American deal and that's the way it goes, because that wouldn't be fair either, right? To
Mm,
both sides,
mm,
right? But there's got to be a balance. You gotta
mm,
sort of start with um a fair and reasonable intention, right?
mm,
And then you have to
mm,
sort of figure out what is, fair given the amount of money being risked or the amount of time, being
mm,
invested in this project or artist. And I think that there's a fair balance. And I don't think that the way that you define fair is as simple as saying it should be an American deal or a UK deal. I think that there's a whole we're not yet at a place where we can point to 10 Indian artists that have broken
mm,
globally, right?
mm,
So until we get to like at least there, right? There's a
mm.
whole
Yeah.
different, calculus that you have to put into your risk, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And we're not yet at a place where the same amount of streams bring in anywhere close to the same amount of money,
Mm.
um, at best you're looking at like 1/10, it's not like a small difference. It's a stark
Yeah.
difference,
It's a significant difference. Yeah. Yeah.
so, I think you just have to sort of approach it with, a fair lens.
Yeah.
And that usually means a dialogue, with the manager or the artist or the
Mm.
label as to what that might look like,
Yeah.
and I found in my dealings in the Middle East or India that people are open to a reasonable conversation,
Yeah.
as long as, particularly when your starting point isn't like somewhere completely off the Richter scale in terms of fairness,
Mm. Yeah.
and so as I say, we don't do that. We try to approach it, from a place that feels, fair and appropriate,
Yeah.
relative to the amount of investment or risk that we're putting to this. And look, I look, when I did the deal with Divine and with Gully Gang,
Mm.
that was 2018, I think.
Mm.
Nobody was signing Indian artists,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
publishing deals. That wasn't
Yeah.
a thing. You know,
Yeah.
it's still fairly novel. And so I think that you got to just kind of approach, and at the same time, who was thinking about you know Hindi Indian hip
Yeah.
hop 2018 as trying to break in
Yeah.
America or the UK with that. That wasn't a thing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So the world has moved on and changed,
Mm.
and things have evolved since then. And I'm very pleased to see that the work that we've done amongst everybody else in the industry is sort of, we're all pushing this boulder up a hill,
Mm. Yeah.
um, and we're at a better place, but we're not quite yet at the promised land. And so deals just have to be a fair reflection for both sides, I think.
Yeah. And fair enough. I mean, I'm also, conscious about the fact that this is, at the end of the day, it is a business, right? So this is where people like me come in, and I work a lot more with artists. So you're kind of educating them about this is what you're signing up to, and I think more often than not, as long as the artist is aware of what they're signing up for, then I mean you're taking an educated decision, right? It's just about getting them to sign something without them understanding what it is. That has been the problem in most cases, which I feel is changing today.
Yeah.
So, and, but since you mentioned, you know, top 10 or whatever, like Indian artists who made it big, who are you kind of, you know, keeping an eye out for? Like, is there someone that's like got your attention? Are you any favorites that you've been observing or, listening to in the last, say, 6 months that have caught your attention?
There's a whole bunch. Uh,
Name your top five.
oh man, I don't know. I'm blanking right now. Here's what I will say, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm much more interested in music that is homegrown from, like, born in India and South
Mm,
Asia than I
mm,
am in the wave of what you would call, I guess, NRI artists, coming out,
yeah.
you
So
know.
you're talking about, I mean, I'm not,
I
Hanuman
say
Train
that,
cannot be on your top five. I'm
yeah.
not talking about, I'm not talking about, I'm not talking about the, you know,
um, yeah, look,
you like you said, the
there's a
NRI.
lot of stuff that I like. I really liked Yohani because, yeah, and I know
Mm,
she's not Indian, obviously, but I liked what she was. I liked the fact that there was somebody from Sri Lanka that sort of was doing
mm,
something
mm.
quite sort of. I mean, that Manike thing, I think, came out of
Yeah,
completely left field.
yeah,
And, when you talk to her team, even they don't know how it be. Like, they're like, we don't, like, that was completely organic. We didn't do anything,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And I think that that's an interesting sort of magical moment, where you
yeah,
start getting calls from people in Canada or the UK or Sri Lanka or India, and it
yeah.
just sort of becomes a thing. I think she's super talented. She's a rapper. She's a singer. We've had her
Mm,
do things. We got her involved even before we signed her. We got her on the Cricket World
mm,
Cup remix with Sean Paul, and she killed that. She's the kind of artist that when you throw something in front of her, she sort of rises to the challenge, which
yeah,
to me is, the sign of a star.
yeah.
We had her involved in our first writing camp in Abu Dhabi at the end of last
Mm,
year. She killed it out there. So
mm,
that sort of artist is what
mm.
excites me.
Okay.
I kind of don't want to name names because there's a bunch of people that I'm interested in that I'm trying to sign that I don't necessarily want to advertise right now.
Right.
But I will say that uh, I I really like and I say this the when I say about the NRI artist, what I mean by that is I've actually I'm drafting a blog right now just about that. And I say that like I feel, slightly hypocritical because I am an artist, right? I mean, by that definition, but there is something to be said. Like, when I was living in Toronto and then London, there was a real, scene
Mm,
around, um, um, second generation Indian kids that were,
mm,
asserting their culture and
yeah,
wanting to sort of sort of capture that and sort of
mm,
introduce it to Western audiences. And there was a
yeah.
little bit, and I say this with the greatest of, honesty and respect. I think there's always been a little bit of a slight elitism about that, in that there was a view amongst the Westerners that they knew production, they knew what was
Ah,
cool, they had the
yeah,
swag, right? Better
yeah,
than those guys over there, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
because, look, frankly, production and the approach to production was also gatekept by
yeah,
Bollywood, and
yeah.
Bollywood wasn't always the coolest thing in the world,
Oh, you just opened the can of worms now. Great,
right?
great. I'm going to discuss this. Yeah.
so there was this sort of a little bit of, sort of nose in the air a little bit about the second gen kids going, I'm going to show these guys what cool is.
Yeah.
And and you know I don't I never really had a dog in that fight because I didn't grow up. I grew up in I was a brown kid amongst a bunch of Italians in Montreal, so I didn't grow up around brown people, and then when I moved to Toronto and I moved to London, then I sort of got sort of immersed in the scenes out there. But that was definitely a sense that you got from the scene,
Mm,
in some of these places. And um, and when I really started spending time in India, I I got a completely different perspective, and I just felt like the Indians were way cooler than the Westerners, and
yeah.
and and I'm not saying that because I'm speaking to somebody in India. I genuinely feel like there was a bit of an effortless a way that
Yeah.
they sort of expressed themselves, right?
Mm,
Where they
mm,
weren't necessarily trying to tokenize their culture, right?
yeah.
Because they just were, you know. You don't have to say I'm brown, I'm brown, I'm brown, right? Like you're brown. We know like, and so like, and there was something about that I found when I first started spending time in India and really hanging out
Mm,
and, not just going to a hotel and going to meetings, but started to sort of get
mm,
involved with people in the scene, building
mm,
friendship and spending a lot of
mm,
time in people's homes, right?
mm,
Um, I, I I started to realize, like, actually, there's something much more powerful about being able to own that, right?
mm,
And then the combination of that, as well as the last, decade, where, it's easier to record, there's less gatekeepers, social media can find your audience,
yeah.
easier. And so you no longer need all that stuff that we used to need, and now I look at it and I'm like, yeah, there's something really exciting, much more exciting about what's going on in the homeland to me
Mm,
than um than outside. Now that's not to say that there's, look, I am a brown artist who raps in English, and, like, I try to express myself as an artist the best I artistically can, the way that I learned how to make music, but and there, I'm sure there will be heroes. Like, I think Nitin Sawhney is a genius at the way that he does it, he's
mm,
not
mm,
he's quite uniquely him,
mm, mm,
he wears his culture in, you hear it in his music, but you also hear flamenco and you hear jazz and you hear, he's this sort of incredible, and he's just
yeah.
one of the more talented people in the world, so Nitin always captured that balance in a really credible and cool way,
Yeah. Yeah.
and he didn't tokenize it, he didn't make it cheap, and
Was
I
like
think that,
real fusion, authentic way without it being, like you mentioned, it wasn't just world music in quotes and tokenized. It just,
yeah, yeah,
you're,
and he fought those battles, he was fighting
yeah,
those
yeah.
battles, and, you know, um, fighting the good fight when nobody really else was, and when they were
Mm,
calling it the Asian underground, he was the one saying, I'm not part of that, or don't,
mm,
I'm not Asian underground, I'm just music,
yeah.
and I wanted to be, I was in the Asian underground. I was like, yo, like, don't, why are
Yeah.
you, you know what I mean? Like, I didn't understand his resistance at the time, now being a little bit older, I totally get it,
Yeah.
he carved his own path in his own unique way, and he didn't cheapen his output in any way or try to make it more exotic, by,
Mm,
it was very much him, and it still is, and there is a wave of artists these days that I feel are, you know, it grates on me a little bit. If anything, it makes me more excited about what's really happening in India, and I really think that the global stars that we're going to see, coming out of the Indian subcontinent are going to be
mm,
artists that are not necessarily trying to pander. I don't think that, you know, I don't think that the big hit that we think is going to happen for an Indian artist is going to happen because somebody made a pop song that sounds like a Katy Perry song. No, I don't.
Mm,
I think it'll be like Manike. I think it'll be like this thing. Like what? How is that the thing? But it is.
yeah, yeah,
And that to me is much more exciting. And exactly why we're doubling down in what we're doing at PopIndia. We're really exciting about what's
yeah,
happening. Really excited about what's happening regionally. I'm very excited about, um, you know, just everywhere. The South Indian stuff, the Punjabi stuff.
yeah.
And and by the way, I'm not dissing the Punjabi artists from Canada. If that's what like that's not where I was going with this one. But I think the reason some of those artists are doing so well is because they're doing it well. Like they're not. There are those that do it well, and then those that
Yeah.
are trying to pander. And I think the one when you try to pander, you sort of lose something in the mojo. You know.
Mm, mm. So I mean, I feel like when I'm as an Indian kid, like I'm born and brought up in India, and exposed to all the film industry music and uh, non-film music was referred to as indie music for the longest time, right? Like today we know that indie music means something different, but when I think about indie music, I'm talking about like the '90s where you had your Alicia Chennai and Bidu, like all of
Yep.
these basically all the Magna Sound artists, right? Like
Mhm.
that was your indie music, and they had a very distinct sound. And then along with that, I think, especially with like the onset of the internet and your exposure to music that is not mainstream, it's not like your Michael Jackson and your Madonna and all of that, which was anyway commercially available. But actually getting access to music like from artists like Nitin Sawhney or Punjabi MC, which
Mhm.
are very distinct Indian sounds, but
Yep.
not in the traditional sense. Like the I don't like using the word fusion because I feel that word was bastardized back in the day and just like
I
categorized
I
under
couldn't
the
agree
word
more.
like
I hate that word, but
I
I know
hate
it.
that word. But you know what I'm trying to say. So I
Yeah.
feel like today, and that's a conversation that I keep having with artists that I work with as well, that if you're trying to achieve a find your sound, a lot of the young artists who want to like release music, they have it's very clear in their head that they want to sound like Ariana or they want to sound like someone. I was just like, you have so much that you have been exposed to as an Indian kid, like cultural aspects. Why can't we? Why isn't it that you're like looking at getting that out there, expressing from those roots? But I feel so. But this is a much deeper conversation because it also comes from this inbuilt feeling that English is superior.
Yeah.
So you need to, compose or release music in English to be taken seriously to some extent. And the innate conflict over there is that you have regional artists who are way bigger. So if you look at the indie scene or the actual independent scene in India, the English artists don't have such a big following, but they probably have, I think, for the lack of a better word, they have like, a superiority complex because at the end of the day, that's global music, right? But I feel like the regional music probably has a lot more character
Mhm.
because that is actually like pulling from the roots and uh, deriving or getting inspiration from these other Western genres like jazz or funk or like, just kind of blending. Like I heard very recently, I heard a Qawwali Afro song, which
Cool.
is, yeah. And it was very different. And I was just like, see, that's what I'm talking about. Like that's like where you're like drawing inspiration and but you're kind of like retaining the essence of a Qawwali. But
Yeah.
it's kind of like going with the trend of the
I
Afro
feel
music.
like I think I agree with you 100%, right? And yet there's a there's a flip to that as well, which is
Yeah.
that you know
Mhm.
there there are Indians where English is just their language,
I know.
and
I
and
am one of those. I think in English.
and
So
people don't think that. Like people in Canada
yeah.
think that if you meet an Indian that speaks English, that Indian is trying to be hoity-toity. There are people that think that in Canada,
Yes,
like Indians
yes,
who think
it's
that.
true. That's the same case in India as well.
Yeah.
So there's that innate conflict that exists
Yes. And
within music.
so that's obviously wrong, right?
Mm.
Because I've walked down the street randomly in cities in India where, kids are walking home from school and talking to each other in English, and I've noted it in my mind going, man, if I told somebody, if I told somebody in Canada, in Brampton, that this is the thing, they would, because they don't think that in that way, right? They have their own exoticized idea of what India is, right? And
Yeah.
and so and many of the my parents' generation, that was like the first wave of Asian immigrants to Canada, they left India in the 60s and 70s, and they think it's still exactly what they left, right? And they have no idea, that when you go to Mumbai these days, it's really not that different from going to New York or London,
Mm.
the party scene, the
Yeah.
general understanding of popular culture that the average 20-year-old has. I mean,
Yeah.
they know their stuff,
Yeah.
and it's not what the many stereotypes that people have, and so I feel on both sides. So, for example, so you're asking about bands, like I love um, Peter Cat recording
Yeah.
company, right? Like I love those guys, right?
Unpack.
Now
Yeah.
that is as authentic as it gets, even though he's singing in
Yeah.
English,
Yeah.
and so like, but it's almost like it feels odd when you see it, like what are these guys,
Yeah.
and but it's cool because
That's
they
cool.
don't
Yeah.
care what you think of them. They're just doing what they do,
Exactly. Yeah.
and that's the exact sort of yeah,
That's the best. They're not pandering. They're just expressing themselves.
yeah.
So
Yeah, and
yeah.
it feels authentic, and I think that's sort of what I'm trying to get at, that sort of sense of authenticity. I think
Yeah.
audiences, can be dumb, but generally, that sort of that
Yeah.
thing that sort of builds momentum around an act. The
Yeah.
first thing that people pull from is authenticity, whether it's whatever language you're singing in,
Yeah.
and I think like with Peter Cat, it's like you feel that it's legit, and you no matter where, if they're playing in LA or they're playing in Calcutta, it it feels right. They those guys hold their own. They are Peter Cat wherever they go,
Exactly.
and that is cool. That's what makes it cool,
That's
and so so yeah, I feel both sides. I agree with you on both fronts. Now, what you just said, like I I um I was speaking at All About Music in one of the early years, and I was on a panel, and one of the audience members put their hand up, and it was a girl, and she said, um, the question was, do I need to sing in English in order to I want to be a global star. Do I need to sing in English? Right. And, you know,
that is a valid question, though.
well, it's like people, like we were all like kind of falling over ourselves trying to flub through the answer, but it's one of those things that it's sort of, I don't know. I made up, I said something along the lines of you don't or whatever, but it sort of
Yeah.
stayed with me, and I thought about it more and more after, and it's still something I think about, is that question, from the audience.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, like that's exactly the thing, and it's not just, look, I feel like I know this because as a Canadian growing up on hip hop in Canada, in the 90s, you really didn't get taken seriously. And there was this sort of sense that you had to sound like American hip hop in order to be legitimate, you know? And actually, what ended up happening is, whether it's Dream Warriors or whether it's Drake, right? The hip hop that went really global was Canadian hip hop artists that actually carved like, there's nobody quite like Drake, is there? I mean, like, whether you like him or you don't like him, he sort of carved out his own unique lane, and sound, and sounds, pulling from British drill and Afrobeat and you name it, right? But he was musically adventurous in ways that American hip hop wasn't, and he brought American hip hop with him after, right? And with Dream Warriors, we were playing with jazz, hip hop, and all of that stuff well before that was a common thing in America. So, and Caribbean music and stuff before that was a sort of mainstream thing. So, I do think that you have to, you got to not be afraid of being you. And, this idea of mimicking what has been successful already, I think strips away from that sense of authenticity. And that sense of authenticity is the most important spark in building a global audience.
While you're saying this, I was just thinking of like three Indian artists, and they identify themselves as Indian, even though two of them have technically grown up abroad. One being Suraj, it's Hanuman kind. The other one is Sid Sriram, and the third is Diljit. And all three of them, they've all performed at Coachella.
Mm-hmm.
They have very, very distinct sounds. Like Sid Sriram is Carnatic. That's his base. And he's grown up, learning Carnatic music. He made it huge in the film industry and then kind of like focused on his indie work. And he's doing a lot of very interesting Carnatic / R&B work. And it's focusing on regional languages. And I feel like that's kind of carving a niche for himself with that.
I agree.
But he also has his English music, which is very authentic. He's not pandering to anyone. And even Hanuman kind for that matter, I would think that he's like a real global breakthrough. And whether we like it or not, he was taken seriously or accepted globally because of English. Because he spoke like most American rappers do. So you had the white audience also embrace him, right? But what really caught their attention was the video. The music video is what really, really made that song tick. And then everyone kind of went back to the music that he's, released and said, okay, there are references to American pop culture. There's references to Indian history. So he's kind of made that really, that combination click. And Diljit is all out Punjabi with electronic music, and he's great production, all of that. He embodies the real, the Punjabi spirit, and he's very proud of that image that he wants to portray on a world stage. So I feel like each of these artists have such distinct identities, and they're all very authentic. And I think that is something which I'm actually really excited about, because I feel like now these are great examples for us to look at. And some of the artists that I work with or I'm friends with and I follow religiously on social media, like the Indian artists, there are some fantastic artists from India who compose in English, even though that's technically not their mother tongue, right? But that's what comes to them naturally. And they're there. And if you listen to their music, you're not for a second going to wonder about whether this was produced in India or outside. In terms of quality, whether it's composition or the actual acoustic quality of the song itself. And so, I think it's a very exciting time for artists in India. But they're also there's an existential question that they're also up against, given AI and how generative AI is generally progressing. So is that something, do you think that's something that they need to be worried about? Do you think that artists need to be worried about generative AI?
I think that
as an artist yourself.
No, I think like everything else, it'll for the most part, it's going to get fed into a licensing model and we're all going to get paid from it. So I don't think it's going to be the end of the industry. I think that it feels like that until YouTube was the end of the industry until it was licensed, and now it pays us all more than anybody else. So I think it's going to run through a similar process where, everybody in the industry is up in arms about AI. But that's because the tech companies are trying to run off and scrape as much as they can without having to pay anybody, they'll get put into a corner, I hope. And there will be some sort of architecture around ensuring that people who create can get paid for their inspiration or whatever it is that they're doing to feed these AI models, that will then turn into something else. I don't think that it's going to be a killer of the industry. I think what's more worrying is the rhetoric coming from the tech industry around how they look at IP overall. That is concerning, but at the end of the day, that's still all rhetoric. The problem is that, when we look at, all you have to do is turn on the news and you see the tech guys cozying up to our leaders around, particularly in the West. And, you sort of hope that somebody doesn't make a stupid decision because of cronyism, but I am an optimist, and I tend to feel that these, and I also feel like we as an industry have done everything we can to fight technology and progress, like every step of the way. And there's almost no example that you can provide where the music industry was completely against it before it started paying them, and now everybody's for it. We were doing it, in the 70s. They were complaining about people, recording songs off the radio and putting on a cassette tape, and that was the big, sort of issue, right? And then we went through, digital downloads, peer to peer, all of that stuff. We've been through this thing before, and every time we go through it, we act like it's the first time, I don't think that, I think that there will be a world where you can use, AI to help you write a song and then record it and then change it so it's in, Drake's voice, and Drake will get paid from it and his label will get paid from it. And, all of wherever the inspiration is being scraped from or pulled from will have some sort of monetizable, sort of structure, I know that I know that we've been using AI already in very productive ways, like AI is, because of AI, we're able to separate stems on old records, and we were able to apply that to the De La Soul catalog at Reservoir so that we could release this incredible, catalog of music that I grew up on. That is the reason why I'm in the music business, because of those albums. And we were able to get these records mixed again and mastered and re-released. And so it's not all bad. There are ways that we're going to be able to harness the technology. The bigger concern is, frankly, more around the politicians than the tech.
Yes, I mean, I'd like to be optimistic about it. And hopefully this conversation will also age well in the next few years.
We'll see. Yeah.
But yeah, so and I feel like there's a lot, like you mentioned, right? Like when starting with like your Napster, for the matter of the way the music industry has looked at technology, um, from the use of synthesizers to DAWs to any kind of tech that kind of came into the industry. Like if you're going to look at AI as just another aspect of tech, which can make things more efficient. Because when DAWs came into the picture, you had traditional musicians complain about the fact that now you would have someone who did not know how to play an instrument being able to create music using a software. But at the end of the day, it was still the musician or still the person who knew an instrument who was able to use those tools a lot better. So you still need to have talent to be able to do it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I can't like I if I had to do it, it's not like I'm going to sound like, I don't know, A.R. Rahman. I can't, because I'm not him. So that I feel that's the distinction, right? And I think
Look,
that
I
will
think
kind of
you're right.
continue
Like
even.
I worry about a world where anybody can make music and then it's like it's all disposable,
Yeah.
So I'm with you on that, but let's say we do get to that world where, everything is disposable, then everything's going to sort of sound the same. And then suddenly the people with the real talent will become even more valuable,
Yeah,
So,
exactly. Yeah. So
so,
I'm hoping for that. I
yeah,
feel like the real artists can kind of like float up and get the recognition they deserve. And you kind of like, you're able to like segregate talent from just background music.
yeah,
And yeah, so it's going to be, I mean, I think it's going to be interesting in the next 5 years. We're going to see a lot. Like not even five. I think we don't have to like look that far. Maybe in the next 2 years, 24 months, it's
yeah,
going to be pretty intense for the music/tech industry.
yeah.
But yeah, on that note, I think we've come to the end of our episode, and
All
it's
good.
been lovely speaking to you. I think there's so many insights that you've shared, which I think we could probably have another episode to cover as well. But I'm hoping to like meet you in person also sometime when you're in India,
Yes,
and
absolutely.
uh, I will definitely send you a list of artists you should check out.
Please.
If you've not already like heard of them, and you should, definitely, like, if you can catch them live when you're in town, nothing like it. And once again, thank you so much for taking the time out and for talking to me and for sharing your experiences and your journey. I
All
think
good.
with Pop India coming to India, I think we some exciting times ahead. So all the best to Pop India, and thank you once again. And thank you to everyone for tuning in and listening to us.
Well, thanks for having me.